Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good morning to all participants. Welcome to the second installment of the Sustainable Finance webinar series, a collaboration between World Bank Group in Malaysia, the ASEAN Institute of Chartered Bankers (AICB), and Islamic Banking and Finance Institute Malaysia (IFIM). We are living in interesting times. For more than 6 months, we have been dealing with what can be called as the disease of mass disruption, COVID-19. Whether it is from business or consumer perspectives, every fabric of the society is feeling the impact of COVID-19. For today's webinar, we will be discussing the impact of COVID-19 on the financial sector. Joining us today are 4 very experienced speakers. They are Ms. Anna Maria Aviles, Senior Financial Sector Economist of the World Bank, joining us all the way from Washington, D.C. Hi, Anna. Second is Mr. Daud Bikri Abdullah, Managing Director of DV Consulting, a very experienced Islamic finance players. Third is Mr. Pramod Das, Deputy Group Chief Executive Officer, RAM Holdings, and Chief Executive Director of RAM Sustainability Berhad. Last but not least, Ms. Angelia Chin Sharp, Chief Executive Officer and Country Head for Malaysia, BNP Paribas Asset Management. This webinar will be divided into 2 parts. The first part, Ms. Anna from World Bank will be presenting her studies on the impact of COVID-19 on East Asia's financial sector. We will have a brief question and answer sessions after Anna's presentation. The second part will be a panel session where our panelists, Mr. Daud, Mr. Pramod, and Ms. Angelia will share their perspective on the next step for Malaysia's financial sector to recover from the impact of COVID-19. The panel session will be followed by a question and answer session involving all the 4 speakers. Therefore, without further ado, I wish to invite Ms. Anna to present her studies. Anna, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here tonight for me this morning for you. Thank you very much. My name again is Anna Maria Aviles. I am a financial sector economist based in Washington, D.C. I've been with the bank for almost 20 years now, working in different regions and different sectors. And before coming to the World Bank, I work in the central bank in my home country, Colombia. And I also work in the Regional Development Bank for Latin America and in Citibank in the corporate side. Let me start by a historical fact that I didn't know until I started reading about pandemics. The deadliest pandemic in recent history was the Spanish flu, which between 1918 and 1920 infected a third of the world's population and ended the life of about 50 million people. Did you know that more people died because of the pandemic than because of the World War I? So that's an interesting fact that I didn't know. So let me share the presentation now. Okay, can you see? I hope you can see the presentation now. Okay. So clearly we are living unprecedented times. We are in the midst of an economic crisis of major proportions. And Asia, as well as many other countries, is struggling with the resurgence of the pandemic after the early suppression. And for example, tourism has no signs of rebound any time soon. We know that uncertainty is here to stay. We know that the vaccine will take time to produce and after that to be globally distributed. We know there is pandemic exhaustion. People is tired with the lockdowns. We know there will be lasting macroeconomic consequences of the current crisis. And the key concern for authorities around the world is how to maintain the balance between the expenditures needed to maintain the needs of the health sector and to support the economic activity, while at the same time safeguarding financial stability and keeping fiscal discipline. Let me start now by reading a definition related to sustainable finance, which I like because it's a comprehensive one. A sustainable financial center is a financial marketplace that as a whole contributes to sustainable development and value creation in economic, environmental, and social terms. In other words, one that ensures and improves economic efficiency, prosperity, and economic competitiveness both today and in the long term, while contributing to protecting and restoring ecological systems and enhancing cultural diversity and social well-being. This is from the Swiss Sustainable Finance. So let me now turn into the scope of today's presentation. So in this presentation, I will focus on or turn back to the basics of my training as a senior as a financial sector economist, and I will turn to financial stability. Certainly, financial stability ensures economic efficiency. It ensures efficient financial intermediation to the real sector. It protects the use or the efficient use of the public resources, and overall, it supports economic activity, and it will support economic recovery as well. So in this presentation, I'm presenting a study we finished in June this year on assessing non-performing loans in East Asia and the Pacific. And this study I did with my colleagues, Katia Holster, Samir Goyal, and Cristina Palle. So we hope to have it publicly distributed soon. So the regional focus of this presentation is East Asia and the Pacific. Particularly, we'll be focusing on the large ASEAN countries and China. So on the outline, we will go to the recent trends of credit quality. We will look at the vulnerabilities in the financial sector, including the corporate debt and the household debt. We will see with countries, whether countries have an accurate picture of the non-performing loans. So we look at the inconsistencies among definitions. We will then present or take a look at the policy measures that have been implemented in response to the COVID-19. And then we'll look for the considerations, policy considerations in addressing these non-performing loans in times of the COVID. I just realized that the numbering of the outline is all messed up, so excuses for that. So first, let's look at the recent trends of credit quality in East Asia and the Pacific. Asia has been one of the key engines of the world economy in the past couple of decades, with significant rates of GDP growth, accompanied by growing financial deepening. Nevertheless, even ahead of the pandemic, economic growth has been decelerating and influencing the credit quality of bank portfolios. Therefore, pre-existing country-specific vulnerabilities could actually amplify the effect of the pandemic on both the banking sector and the real economy. The credit quality of banks' portfolio is very important for the region due to the significance of the banking sector for the real economy. The ratio of the credit to GDP in the East Asia and the Pacific region achieved a peak of above 200% in 2016. In fact, the ratio in this region is the highest in the world, pointing out to the relevance of preserving a healthy banking sector in the region, and as poor credit quality and banking failures may lead to significant losses for the overall economy. Going now to looking at the non-performing loans. So economic growth in the region has been accompanied by the expansion of the financial systems and continuous credit growth. At the same time, nominal figures of non-performing loans have also risen significantly in many of the East Asian Pacific countries over the past decade. Although the nominal amount of non-performing loans is an indicator of the size of distressed assets, the monitoring of financial stability should look at the non-performing loans as a ratio of the total portfolio, together with the buffers to absorb losses. For most of the jurisdictions, the non-performing loans ratio has been decreasing in the years after the global financial crisis, with some increasing again after 2013, such as in the cases of China, Indonesia, and Thailand. The non-performing loans in the largest ASEAN economies and in China have been in the range of between 1 to 4% of total loans in the last decade. Non-performing loans in Korea and Singapore have been very low, below 1.5%. But let's look at now the vulnerabilities. Even when non-performing loans may be structurally low, in some jurisdictions, there might be additional vulnerabilities that need to be considered. These may come from exposures to a certain type of borrowers or economic sectors, specific market practices, as well as the supervisory regime and the regulatory and the legal framework. Corporate debt in many countries stood among the highest in the world. In China, non-financial corporate debt remains above 150% of GDP. In Singapore and Korea, corporate debt has achieved considerable levels. In Korea, the debt of larger firms is concentrated in market-based instruments, while the small and medium enterprises are largely funded by bank credit. In Singapore, on the other hand, corporates experience a buildup of leverage in the past years, mainly driven by the property and the commerce sectors. In Thailand, while corporate leverage is relatively low compared with regional peers, debt at risk and the rollover risk are somewhat higher. There are signs of weaknesses in the SME sector, with non-performing loans and special mention loans reaching up to 8% this is data as of Q3 in 2018. Turning now to household debt, also high in the region by global standards. In many countries, this is largely explained by the real estate-related lending, typically mortgages. In Korea, household debt is above 90% of GDP. Household lending growth is primarily related to housing. Also, around 1/4 of the total stock of debt is held by households who are retired or close to retirement. In Thailand, assessments by the Bank of Thailand show that household balance sheets have become financially vulnerable, especially for the younger cohort, because they tend to save less, borrow at an early age, and overall they are higher debt burdens. The share of non-performing loans and special mention loans for households have been on the rise, and banks have been competing intensively in the retail loan market and somewhat loosening lending standards to preserve income and market shares. In Malaysia, household debt is high and primarily driven by loans for residential properties. Risks are concentrated among low-income borrowers and those with variable income. Signs of easing in underwriting standards have been observed in 2018, mostly confined to lower-risk borrowers. According to the IMF, house prices have been reported stronger than warranted by macroeconomic fundamentals. A sharp decline in house prices combined with a household income shock and given the bank's sizable real estate-related lending could hurt banks' capital and earnings. But do they have an accurate understanding of the non-performing loans? Two key elements to consider in this region. First, the asset management company. Many countries in the region have extensive experience with asset management companies, or AMCs, to resolve the non-performing loans, such as China, Korea, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. However, some practices followed by the mainly public asset management companies seems to be maintaining some zombie borrowers, which distorts the true figure of the non-performing loans. Therefore, to get a full and real picture of the total amount of the problem loans in the system, it should include those managed by the AMCs in these cases. The second element to consider here is the definition of non-performing loans, which in the region is still heterogeneous across countries and not necessarily aligned with the international standards. At the international level, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision developed a harmonized definition for problem loans, and considers a quantitative and a qualitative component, 90 days past due and unlikeliness to pay, whichever comes first. However, in the region, the regulatory definitions for problem assets differ across countries and do not necessarily follow the Basel Committee harmonized definition, hindering a real understanding of the problem and a comparability across countries. For example, some jurisdictions require NPLs to be reported in gross values, for some other allow figures net of provisions. And another example is that the criteria for upgrading a restructured loan from non-performing to performing status vary across countries. They don't have the consistent treatment for this. Let's look at now the policy measures that have been put in place in the region in response to the current crisis. Authorities around the globe are mitigating the effects on the real economy through a battery of fiscal, monetary, and financial policy measures. Broadly speaking, the measures implemented by governments in the region to provide the borrower relief can be grouped into three. First, governments have provided funds and guarantees to borrowers, either directly or by channeling public funds through financial institutions. Second, authorities have produced some degree of regulatory relief to financial institutions so that they are able to keep the flow of credit channeled to the economy. And third, authorities have promoted changes to some elements in the financial infrastructure so that it can accommodate better to the challenges which are arising with this pandemic. In this slide, we can see that in the first group of measures, which means the provision of fresh funds to borrowers, this has been widely used. For instance, in Cambodia, the government injected capital to the state-owned Rural Development Bank to grant loans to SMEs in the agricultural sector. Another example is the fact that China has also implemented an expansion of re-lending and rediscounting facilities to support manufacturers of medical supplies and SMEs. In the second group of measures, when we're talking about regulatory relief, we see that some jurisdictions have allowed financial institutions to make use of the flexibility that already exists in the regulatory framework. According to a publication produced recently jointly between the World Bank and the IMF, the use of the flexibility existing in the regulatory framework should be one of the first lines of defense to deal with the COVID-19 consequences. The first area where this flexibility has been exercised is allowing banks to use the existing capital and the liquidity buffers. And by dipping into these buffers, banks are able to make use of the funds to provide more credit or absorb some of the losses without the pressure to replenish those cushions immediately. Cambodia, Korea, Malaysia, and Singapore are some of the jurisdictions that have issued explicit guidance in this respect. In some cases, regulatory relief was granted by lowering the minimum capital requirements for some borrowers. This deviates somewhat from the international standards, which is not really a good practice. Some jurisdictions have lowered the credit risk weight for loans to SMEs below the ratio required by the Basel framework. This regulatory relief, by lowering international agreed minimum requirements, not only contributes to undermine the credibility of the prudential framework, but also may have severe consequences for transparency, solvency, and financial stability. Related to moratoria measures, these have been also widely adopted in the region as extraordinary relief measures. In most of the cases, authorities have tried to limit moral hazard by making the measures time-bound and by defining the sectors and loans covered. For instance, in Malaysia, an automatic 6-month moratorium on loan repayments, principal and interest for individuals and for SMEs, was implemented at the end of March this year. In Singapore, borrowers may decide to defer repayments of principal or both principal and interest up to December 31st this year. And in Korea as well, they can postpone principal pay. The postponing of principal payments is available for vulnerable borrowers up to the end of this calendar year. Those countries implementing moratoria have introduced some degree of forbearance, which is somewhat contrary to international recommendations and should be carefully managed. International recommendations request transparency of the exposures that have been subjected to moratoria as a precondition for maintaining trust in the system, for market discipline to work effectively, and for limiting the moral hazard. Last, the COVID-19 crisis has also brought reforms in some elements of the financial infrastructure. In particular, some jurisdictions have updated elements of the insolvency framework to accommodate them to the current challenges. For example, in Singapore, a new bill was submitted to the parliament to update some areas of the legal framework for insolvency. To avoid massive numbers of corporate bankruptcies, Singapore has suspended the obligation of directors to file for bankruptcy. In other countries, in anticipation of an increase in the amount of non-performing loans, the creation of AMC, of asset management companies, is currently under analysis. Let me now turn to the last item and some considerations in addressing problem loans in the times of COVID. In countries where firms were heavily indebted before the COVID-19, many are expected to be under considerable financial stress. In addition, their viability will be threatened, which in turn affect the repayments of banking loans. The World Bank has been providing recommendations on the main elements that countries should consider revising insolvency frameworks. In this sense, it is recommended that during the first stage of the crisis, jurisdictions use relief measures to prevent viable firms from being forced prematurely into insolvency. In a second stage, when a growing number of firms will need insolvency process to survive, it is vital to ensure the smooth functioning of workouts and debt restructuring mechanisms. Similarly, because of the materiality of household debt in some of the countries that could run into trouble, countries will benefit from implementing mechanisms for consumer bankruptcy as well. The World Bank is working in that area and has recommended that countries put in place modern consumer bankruptcy frameworks, ensuring there are flexible options for debt rescheduling and repayment plans. Such mechanisms would help to resolve banking loans to individuals and households in a more orderly manner. Further, they will help to provide more certainty to banks for the procedures to be followed in such insolvencies and to set realistic expectations about the potential loan recoveries. Given that banks in some countries are severely exposed to the dynamics of the real estate market, effective procedures to deal with prompt resolution of the real estate collateral are also encouraged. Modern mechanisms to resolve mortgages should also be considered in anticipation of the escalation of defaults. In countries where lending to state-owned enterprises is material, countries will benefit from removing regulatory incentives that promote an even playing field against private firms, such as excessively relying on government implicit guarantees. The credit quality of the state-owned enterprises has to be evaluated and assessed on the same basis on their own ability to maintain sustainable cash flows as with any other private firms. Regarding the borrower relief measures, credit exit strategies are very important. Any unplanned removal can cause a sharp rise in non-performing loans and significant negative effects on the bank's financial health. Therefore, authorities must implement a careful planning. In addition, as this has been recommended by both the World Bank and the IMF, any additional policy response should minimize opportunities for moral hazard and maintain adherence to sound credit risk management practices. Policy responses have to be time-bound, need a clear sunset clauses and exit strategies, and have to be targeted to ensure that only viable borrowers will benefit. Additionally, as many countries have introduced forbearance, jurisdictions should be careful of the unintended negative consequences of the management of the credit risk. We know that non-performing loans are expected to grow because of the COVID-19 crisis. And experience shows that non-performing loans-related problems are best addressed proactively and early. Reductions of non-performing loans through deliberate policies are associated with significant growth dividends when compared with countries where high NPL ratios persisted over long periods of time. Therefore, effective and early workouts and resolution of non-performing loans are central to avoid loss of confidence in the system and to ensure that the financial sector enables and supports economic activity. Again, these are all based on an analysis we did on the banking sector, but most of these recommendations can actually extrapolate it to other sectors in the financial system. So this is all what I have prepared for you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for very insightful studies. And I see that we have time for at least one question. We have one question. What are your observations on your studies on government-related loans, i.e., projects and their non-repayment?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
Okay, I will repeat it. In your studies, what are your observations on government-related loans, for example, projects, and their non-repayment?
As with everything, depends on it depends on the country context. It depends on the fiscal, financial. It depends on the importance, the strategic importance of the project. But overall, basically, I think, again, it goes back to the point that governments right now are very stretched on resources. The needs are way bigger than the resources that they have available, and they need to prioritize and use those resources that they have efficiently. And I think the immediate, of course, the immediate element of importance is the health of the population and the health of the economic activity, at least encourage spending that will support the economic activity and the recovery in the post-crisis period.
Thank you, Anna. We have another question. The question goes like this: Any specific example of government influencing finance sector via non-financial support, non-capital, for example?
Governments influencing the financial sector through non-financial support.
Via non-financial support, non-capital.
I think many. I mean, it's for good and for bad. I mean, I think it happens similar to the position of the World Bank. So the government provides not only the capital, not only the resources, but the supervisory and the legal and regulatory frameworks. The government can convene, the government supervises, the government can set a tone in the transparency and the way of appropriately implement reforms, or the opposite. So I think it is definitely every action, and right now every action the government takes will be under huge scrutiny, again, because of the limited resources that are available and the huge needs of all countries globally.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I think that will be the time for your session. Will you join us later for the question and answer at the end of the
Yes,
session? Yeah?
I will be connected.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Moving on to the second part of this webinar, we shall now hear from our panelists their view on the next step forward for the financial sector to recover from this pandemic. To set the ball rolling, I would like to invite Mr. Daud Bikri Abdullah to share his views and perspective. Daud, all yours. Daud, we can hear you. Okay. Okay, Daud, we are ready for you. Okay, we seem to have a little bit of connectivity issue with Mr. Daud. Pramod, perhaps we hear from you first.
Okay, can you hear me loud and clear?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you.
Loud and clear?
Yes, very clear.
Okay, Daud, I think your mute is off. You want to try one more time?
Yeah.
Okay, I can't hear him. Then you want me to continue, Yusri?
Yeah. I will go back to Daud.
Okay. Given the time, I'll keep what I have to say very briefly, but I have been a banking analyst in the past, so just carrying on from Anna, the Malaysian banking system is moving from a position of strength. Yes, it will take a bit of hit from COVID. You can get more details from the RAM website. We have an article, so I'm not going to get into that. But getting straight into the sustainable finance angle, looking at some data from UNEP-FI with 220 banks and 60 countries, there are three main areas that the financial sector has worked with coming out of COVID. Supporting companies, partnering with governments on the economic and social impact, and society's access to financial services. Globally, when I looked at some of the examples, the common one is moratorium on loans for individuals, SMEs, and corporate loans. There was definitely a phase-in into digital and cashless payments. Investment banks, some banking groups also were involved in the issuance of pandemic bonds or prevention of pandemic bonds or vaccine bonds. There was even a bank that went into COVID bereavement support. Some donated their media spend to the government for health advertising. Some even partnered with their competitors to distribute masks and finance testing programs. But where I want to lead to it, swans have always been used to describe a lot of events. There are black swans and gray swans. There's a new swan I read about that it's called a green swan, and this whole incident is a green swan. So in general, what is happening is people are moving away just from looking at climate change to look at other things that we need to take care of, such as biodiversity, society, the ESG, so social side has been underlooked. So when I looked at the principle of responsible investing toolkit for emerging markets, which coincidentally they work with World Bank, they've come up with a financial policy support for sustainable finance, covering pension fund regulation, stewardship engagement, ESG disclosure, and sustainable finance strategy. So you can Google this and look it up. I'm not going to go into it in depth, but let me leave you with this thought. It's something where the whole ecosystem, not just the financial sector, has to take care of. So regulators, the government are involved through ISCO, the network of greening of financial institutions, the sustainable stock exchanges, depositors making choices in which FI they want to place their money with, investors investing in banks that are responsible and shunning themselves away from irresponsible banks, credit rating agencies that are part of the ESG and credit rating movement, such as RAM, that engage with banks and issuers, But in essence, there's the green market, the social bond market. Where I see change happening is basically we've dealt in an environment that banks were substituted by cashless means. So like you can use GrabPay, you didn't have to go to the ATM. Basically, there are going to be changes. We've all undergone changes. Some changes we're not going to go back on. So that's the gist of what I can leave the audience with this week.
Okay, thank you, Pramod. Certainly, it's a very interesting perspective, especially on green bonds and the fact that the current traditional model is being challenged. Shall we now invite Daud again to present his perspectives and views? Daud? Daud, can you get us through? Okay, we still have a bit of a connectivity problem with Mr. Daud. Angela, can you just step in with sharing your views? Yes, Angela. Yes.
Hi, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank
good morning, Angela.
thank you, IFFIM, as well as World Bank for inviting me to be part of this esteemed panelist. Since Pramod talked about, since I'm representing a banking group, the only panelist here is representing the a banking group other than Anna. And adding on to what Pramod mentioned about, banks collaboration and also helping out during this pandemic, maybe it's good that I also share in the perspective of BNP Paribas. We committed 50 million euros across 30 countries, where we, like what Pramod say, help out in terms of providing funding, masks, even supporting the Pasteur Institute of France in terms of their research for the next vaccine, or at least something to help in terms of supporting COVID-19. Talking generally in terms of what we have also observed in my role as a fund manager, maybe, hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah. Sorry, there was a bit of echo. In my role as fund manager, what we have seen is definitely aligned to what Anna has also shared as a fund manager in terms of how we look at the finance sectors. Of course, when we talk about sustainability, I think importantly, governance is very important. We are going to see that banks or financial institutions with high asset quality will outperform the rest. That covers globally as well as regionally and also locally here in Malaysia. Banks with lower asset quality will take time, obviously, to recover from this pandemic. When we talk about, banks also playing a role, I will more covered in the region of Southeast Asia. The moratorium that Anna mentioned about, if you talk about, banks that actually showed the most commitment during this crisis in the region in Southeast Asia is, I would honestly say, it's going to be Malaysia. 55% of the total loan books in Malaysia were under moratorium support. If you compare to the region, compared to the banks in Thailand, it's 33%, Philippines 22%, Indonesia 16%, India 11%, and Singapore 10%. So, this really helped, especially when we talk about SME as well as personal loans as well. This will definitely help them tide through this challenging environment because of COVID-19. What we have also observed during the COVID-19 is the push to accelerate digitalization. The good thing is, at least in the case of Malaysia, many of us already moved on to at least some form of internet banking. And then that's thanks also the push from regulators in the country in terms of moving towards more digitization rather than manual. And during this crisis, you see, just as an example, in Philippines, because of COVID-19, and you can see that Philippines continues to have a challenging environment in terms of the number of COVID-19 cases. Philippines alone, in terms of online banking, has jumped more than 60% due to COVID-19. So COVID-19 has also changed behavior of many individuals, including businesses, to actually move towards more online banking. I will stop here because I believe that David Daud, maybe his mic is working now.
Okay.
And yeah, and then I can take on more questions and answers later.
Okay. Thank you, Angelia. Okay, David, Daud,
Well, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, finally.
Okay. My apologies. The gremlins of technology, but nothing that a quick reboot can't solve. We got the batting order wrong, but firstly, my thanks to World Bank, IBFIM, and AICB for inviting me. I'm going to try and keep my comments brief, but as a proud permanent resident of Malaysia, I would say Malaysia's reputation globally has been enhanced significantly by its response to COVID-19. You just have to look at the global COVID index and the way it has responded and the way it has tackled this. It's consistently been in the top 5 or 6 countries in the world. And that is indicative of the way it has been thought through. Malaysian government has taken independent professional advice rather than looking at the politics of this. And to quote one of the advisors, Dr. Jamillah Mahmood, who's advising the Prime Minister on this crisis, one should never waste a good pandemic. So this actually presents a tremendous opportunity. It's an opportunity to move from critical thinking to creative thinking. Something that we've probably all been brought up is to be critical in our thoughts. It's now about being creative. And Malaysia has been creative, particularly in the first phase of addressing the crisis. And therefore, in my view, and I'm allowed to say this, Malaysia and Malaysians should not be malu. They shouldn't be shy or embarrassed to actually promote what they're doing. Now, there's still a long way to go. The business model has changed. It's now very much got to focus on value creation. And this opportunity to change should be seized. It's not an opportunity to cut corners. Sadly, some organizations around the world are using the crisis as an excuse to circumvent environmental standards, and that's not the way forward. But generally, what I've seen globally, and specifically in Malaysia, is that there's an understanding there will be no reversion to normal. There is no way we're going back. The only way is going forward. And therefore, it's extremely important that we focus on creative thinking and creating this value. And I wanted to finish, to allow questions, but by really reacting to the way forward in terms of value creation mechanisms. And I've got 3 areas that I think not only financial institutions need to focus on, but regulators as well as industry as well. And what I've seen during the crisis, particularly in this region, is SMEs coming to the forefront. The creative thinking and innovation is coming from them, not from the big guys. That sounds like a sweeping generalization, but the ability to adapt and to think creatively, the engine room of the economy is very much the SME. And as Angelia just said, the digital economy, the way in which we can actually do things much smarter these days using that technology is being adapted very, very well by the SMEs. So the 3 areas I just want to spend a couple of minutes on: reducing risk, 1, increasing profits, and unlocking growth opportunities. Here, in reducing risk, we have to have a creative think about supply chain disruption due to both local and global environmental and social issues. We need to look at our resources and demand shortages due to the erosion of brand and reputation. This is an opportunity to enhance brand and reputation if you act in the right way, but also regulatory risk locally and globally related to social and environmental factors. It's not just about the accounting. Many years ago, as a consultant, I dealt with mergers and acquisitions 30 years ago, and I came up with a paper which was called iceberg theory. Mergers and acquisitions focused on what was visible above the surface, the money, the finance. But 90%, the people, the process, and the technology below the surface was ignored, and 9 out of 10 mergers failed because they failed to get into the necessary requirements for people, process, and technology. So regulatory and from the government level, there's a great deal that needs to be done to get the balance right with social and environmental factors. The second point, increasing profits. You've got to look at the efficiencies within your own operations, and obviously if you're in financing or a financial intermediary, you have to help and support your clients in that particular area. Obvious areas would be focused initiatives in areas of energy, of waste in particular, and environmental management. They can make significant differences. And indeed, there are applications out there that individuals can set their targets to come within the 7.6% reduction that each human being has to perform on carbon footprint. You can track that daily now with apps which really change the way you operate your life. And we have to extend these efficiencies across the whole supply chain and think about it holistically. Finally, in unlocking the growth opportunities, we need superior access to financial resources in both the public and private equity markets. For 20 years, I've been saying Islamic finance is about the efficient and effective mobilization of capital for the benefit of the real economy. Here is our chance to really show up and make a difference. We have to unleash a company's innovation potential. That innovation potential is not going to be trying to get back to the old normal. It's going to be about creative thinking, and we need to encourage that kind of thinking. We have to look very carefully at our recruitment, engagement, and retention of our human capital. There's going to be much more of the gig economy. So the idea of permanently working for somebody, I think, is past. I think it's going to be horses for courses and forming teams around challenges and problems. And that, for large institutions, including financial institutions, is going to present an intense challenge. We're already seeing it in the bubbles that are being created, where people are not going to go back to work all at the same time. Already, many financial institutions are bubbling into 2 or 3 bubbles, so teams are coming back into the office. But they're learning, and I think what we will be learning is there'll be much more gig employment, even in financial institutions in the future. Focus has to be on the customer satisfaction and building that loyalty. And the values that you create through sustainability are attracting the client base. And through that behavior, you commend trust and you have a social license to operate. All of these things are challenging and are different. But as there will be no reversion to a normal that we've been used to, now is the opportunity to change. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Yusri, and to the audience for their questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. I just want to ask you a question. Listen to you. Do you think that our financial institutions are ready for this change now? Do you think that they have the stamina for to make the necessary changes that you mentioned just now?
Are you talking about the politicians? I missed that word there.
No, I mean, our financial institutions ready for this change? Face all this, yeah. The simple yes or no, the answer is no. But there's got to be a lot of adjustment, because this is why I'm sort of thinking of the creative thinking stage of this. It's very important to get the creative thinkers there. You've got to be asking, why can't I do this in this way? Radical changes, moving from a debt-based economy to a risk-sharing economy, moving to an economy which is focused on a better balance with the environment and achieving the SDGs but still generating a profit, probably means a complete change in the way the financial system operates, and not using currencies, but using other units which are digitized and which are traded and exchanged. The idea, and I know already the central bank here and others in the region are looking at mechanisms whereby your assets can be mobilized even overnight. For example, I feel guilty. I go to bed at night and there's 100 ringgit sat in my wallet doing nothing. If I could digitize that, it could be invested overnight and be used to help, agricultural production in Indonesia overnight, and I make a turn on it, and it's used effectively. So there's a lot of thought needs to go into this. The simple answer is no, but it can be done,
And it's encouraging to see that there is political will to make this change. And that is why I'm saying Malaysia is emerging as a global leader in this space, and it needs to maintain the momentum. And will have the support of many both thinkers and doers in order to achieve that.
Yusri, can I jump in on the question?
Yes, Pramod, please do.
My short answer is the change has already happened. Just look at ourselves. Those of you who have friends or colleagues that never did online shopping have started going on online shopping. At the beginning, I went to withdraw money from ATM to make sure I had cash, but I never used the cash because I did all my purchases online, and basically it was proven that I didn't need to actually have cash to carry on my activity. So banks who never had flexible working arrangements were overnight being forced to work from home, and all of us were running 100% at home. So what was proven to be a maybe was done, and there's no question about whether it was effective or not. I think all of us worked 10 to 12 hours to our health detriment, but efficiency was there. So my message was there is a sweet spot somewhere between Islamic finance, digital banking, sustainable finance, supply chain, SME, and I sum it up with spelling sustainability with a dollar sign. We need to do what we need to do to make it profitable, sustainable, effective, and the S also is scalable. So you don't need branches anymore. You don't need to be a gigantic bank. You can do it on a peer-to-peer basis. You can do it on your phone. You can do it with GrabPay, not advertising GrabPay, but that's an example. But banking has changed. And I end with that.
Okay. Thank you, Pramod. Thank you, David, and thank you, Pramod. Okay, I think we're about a few minutes before 10. I think we should have time for some questions. Okay, the first one that we actually received is if the banks are helping SME and individuals, will the bank in Malaysia be in trouble? Perhaps, what do you think, Daud, on this one, these questions? Okay, can you hear? Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I think you've got to be prudent. The customers are going to be challenged, and there's a duty certainly in Islamic banks for you to help your customers, but you've got to be sensible and you've got to be balanced in the way that you do that. So this is about how you effectively circulate the money that you have and get it to the points where it's going to do the most good. But it's not necessarily just about helping companies to survive. You've actually got to pick the right companies. If I go back to the points I was raising, that if you're going to unlock the growth opportunities and reduce the risk, you've got to look very, very carefully at the overall supply chain. So, financing and funding a particular company may not be the best decision. There are certain companies which fall into an area which are worthy of support for a whole slew of reasons, in terms of employment, in terms of job creation, in terms of sustainability, and so on. But it does mean that the financial institutions are going to have to continue changing their mindset from critical to creative thinking.
Okay. Thank you, David. Okay, we have perhaps one question I think directed to Anna. Are there an example of how countries are utilizing sustainable finance as a trajectory for recovery?
Sorry, examples of how using sustainable finance?
Of countries that are utilizing sustainable finance as a trajectory for recovery. I think the question is that any of the country that actually adopt sustainable finance as part of the recovery plan.
So definitely, I think just going back to what Pramod said, the combination of the digital and sustainable, it's a win-win, and it will be, I think, on the post-recovery period. And that combined with the Islamic finance, I think Malaysia is definitely in the lead. I think it's too early to see. I mean, countries right now are just struggling to kind of barely see and strategize of what's going forward. So I haven't really seen any specific, or I don't have in mind any specific example. But again, I think that Malaysia is definitely on the lead, and this could be a very good opportunity to position itself ahead of the curve.
Okay. Thanks, Anna. We have another question here. I think this will be suitable.
Just a quick answer to that. The example would be Malaysia, Sukuk Prihatin. Read, Google and read the news.
Yeah. We have Sukuk Prihatin. I think it's still open, if not mistaken, right? Okay. I think this next question will be for Angela. Any insights on the impact of COVID-19 towards the depositors and investors' behavior? I think the question is, they want to know in terms of the effect of COVID-19 to the behavior of investors and depositors. Is there any change in terms of their investing behavior?
Sorry, can you? I think I will answer this question together with Siti. There's a question from Siti about appetite for ESG.
Yes.
You know, after this, so I will also add that together.
Okay.
I think very important. You know, when you talk about depositors, then you're talking about savings. I think when you talk about savings, then you have to look at in terms of the economic impact of what happened with COVID-19 on each individual. So there are many people who at this moment will also need to dip into their own pension funds to sustain during this challenging environment. So that means that can also impact the ability to continue the savings plan. Whereas those who have, then they can continue to take opportunity with the markets. I think the markets have already run as well, maybe 2 months ago, to take opportunities of where the market levels are to actually increase their investment. Answering to Siti's question on ESG commitment, especially during this time, I think importantly, even whatever happened, COVID pre or post, the importance of understanding why there's been a lot of talk about sustainable investment. And you can see that there's already a drive coming from not just regulators, but also institutional investors itself. If we don't address the ESG today, whatever that's happened, the past 6 months, is that we will all suffer in the future and our future generation. So it's something that we cannot look away, because if we continue to do business as usual, it's not going to solve the problem that we are already facing today. And the more what has happened to COVID-19, the more we need to accelerate our thinking and our commitment towards addressing climate risk. Because if we don't address this problem, then we are all going to suffer in terms of our food, the water that we consume. We are going to continue to face issues, socio-economic issues, because of migration. The reason people are migrating into more developed countries is because there is no more opportunities for them in the land that they have in their own country, because they cannot cultivate. Then again, you are talking about, the impact on supply chain, and Malaysia being in an economy where we are supplying to many global supply chain. There is the importance for us to address these issues, because if we don't start looking at this and think that we need to solve the problem of what's happening COVID-19, and let's put this in the back of our shelf and then look at it 12 months later, then I think we are all going to make a big mistakes. As a portfolio manager, we are looking at ESG in our investment because it helps us to mitigate the risk. Because if we don't look at integrating ESG in our investment philosophy, then we will overlook the risk that's going to happen in the companies that we invest in, because things are going to change and things are going to impact the finances, which is what we are seeing today. And that's why, ESG is not about, doing the good, but also in terms of the investment world of how we look at the risk in how we analyze a company. And answering to Siti, do you think that there is going to be, people are looking at ESG? I think there's still need for us to continue to educate investors and even the business community alike in terms of why we need to look at climate risk, why we need to look at the way we conduct business and how that's going to impact the E and the S and the G. When we look at ESG, it's not talking about climate, but we're also talking about how we also treat human labor, corruption, and that's part of also governance as well, and that's going to impact the share prices of a company. So that's just a summary of why we should not ignore ESG today. We should continue to have this discussion. And I think, when we are looking at the topic of our webinar series today, sustainable finance, that's precisely the conversation that we are having, and because it is an important conversation that we should continue to have. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelia. Anyway, that's all the time we have for question and answers. Before we end, I wish to invite all the speakers to give their final thoughts. Maybe 30 seconds each. We can start with Daud.
I'll unmute myself quickly, 30 seconds. So I just reinforce, I think Angelia has summed it up very, very well, so I endorse what she said. The mindset is being changed, prolonged by the 5 or 6 months of the change that we've been through, and we need to continue accelerating that. And the energy should not be directed into going back to normal, because that will never be achieved. The energy should be focused on the change and creative thinking and educating people, and this will be a slow process, to think much more creatively and to adapt.
Anna, any final thoughts?
Thank you. I agree with what has been said, in particular with what Angelia just said. I think that commitment to sustainable finance, I think the current crisis and this pandemic is perhaps the best example of why sustainable finance is important, why looking at climate change issues and sustainability is important. And it's possible. I mean, the world actually stopped for a while, and you could see the impact in the environmental indicators right away. So it's definitely needed, and it needs to be embedded into all what we do, including the financial sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Last thoughts?
You can make a change. So it's left to all of us to be responsible, and those of us who can influence responsible finance have to influence them. So I end with one letter, S with a $sign in the middle.
Angelia,
yes.
Any final thoughts?
Yes. Adding to what all the panelists and myself have shared, I think we are very lucky today. We are living in a digital age, unlike during the Spanish flu. So today we can, like what Daud say, we need to be innovative. We need to think out of the box. We have the digital platforms today, so we just need to look at the opportunity set that is available to us and think of how to use that and use that right and responsibly. And I think we can do more together. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. That's all we have for today's webinar. On behalf of IFFIM, World Bank, and AICB, we would like to thank all the speakers for their time and valuable insights. Certainly a very, very refreshing ideas. And to all participants, 300 of you today, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to welcome you at the next webinar in September. Thank you very much. Take care and stay safe. Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Daud. Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Thank you, Pramod. Thank you, Angelia. Thank you.